There is a story that the culture of ambition tells about the lives of the most extraordinary achievers in history. It is a story of relentless effort of men who sacrificed sleep and leisure and ordinary human comfort on the altar of an all-consuming purpose, who worked while others rested, who turned every available hour into productive output, who understood that the difference between the ordinary life and the extraordinary one was simply the willingness to work longer, harder, and with less regard for the body's requests for mercy. This story is told about Napoleon Hill's subjects. It is told about Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller and Edison. It is told about the 500 most extraordinary achievers of the American industrial era with a specific, convenient, motivationally useful confidence that the people telling the story have rarely tested against the actual historical record. The actual historical record tells a different story. John D. Rockefeller, the man who built the most powerful business empire in American history, the man who became the world's first billionaire, the man whose organizational intelligence and strategic vision reshaped the global economy was, by the documented accounts of everyone who worked with him, a man of moderate work hours, consistent rest, daily naps, and a specific disciplined protection of his non-working time that his contemporaries frequently found puzzling in a man of such extraordinary ambition. He quit at noon. Not every day, not in the earliest years of the most intense organizational building, but as the empire matured and as Rockefeller's understanding of his own cognitive functioning deepened through observation, he progressively shortened his working hours and lengthened his resting ones. He lived to 97. And the Standard Oil empire, which he had built through one of the most concentrated periods of organizational intelligence in the history of commerce, continued to operate, to grow, and to compound, not despite his shortened hours, but in significant part because of what those shortened hours preserved. Charles Darwin worked 4.5 hours a day, documented, measured. His son Francis produced a detailed account of his father's working schedule that has been cited in the scientific literature on creative productivity for decades. Darwin's working day was divided into 3 focused sessions, none longer than 90 minutes, separated by walks and rest and activities that his contemporaries considered beneath the dignity of a serious scientist. He was frequently ill. He napped every afternoon. He finished work by mid-afternoon and spent the evenings in family life and light reading. He produced work that changed the course of human thought, not despite the 4.5 hours, because of what the 4.5 hours, properly structured and properly bounded, were able to contain. Henri Poincaré, the French mathematician, who made foundational contributions to topology, celestial mechanics, and the theory of functions, and who came within a decade of Einstein's formulation of special relativity, worked exactly 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, 4 hours total. He described this as the maximum duration at which his mathematical thinking was genuinely productive, and anything beyond it as the increasingly expensive production of increasingly poor work that would need to be undone the next morning. G.H. Hardy, the Cambridge mathematician who discovered Ramanujan and whose own contributions to analytic number theory were among the most significant of the 20th century, declared with characteristic directness that 4 hours of concentrated mathematical work was the absolute maximum that a serious mathematician could sustain in a day without diminishing returns, and that most of the best mathematical thinking was done in less. Charles Dickens wrote from 9 until 2, then walked sometimes for hours, sometimes for the rest of the afternoon, and considered the walking as essential to the writing as the desk time. Anthony Trollope wrote a fixed number of words each morning before any other activity, and then, having met the quota, stopped entirely and turned his attention to other things. Beethoven worked from dawn until approximately 2 in the afternoon, and then walked sometimes for several hours, processing what the morning had produced. The pattern is so consistent across so many of the most productive, most creative, most genuinely extraordinary minds in the history of human intellectual and artistic achievement that it cannot be coincidence. 4 to 5 hours of concentrated, high-quality, genuinely productive work, then rest. Then the kind of unfocused, regenerative, wandering attention that the culture of ambition dismisses as unproductive leisure, and that the science of human cognitive performance increasingly identifies as the specific, irreplaceable partner of the concentrated hours that preceded. This is what Napoleon Hill observed in the men he studied, not the 16-hour days that the hustle culture has attributed to them. The specific, disciplined, quality over quantity management of cognitive resources that distinguishes the people who build something extraordinary and lasting from the people who work very hard for a very long time and produce very ordinary results. Before we can understand why the 4-hour pattern produces better long-term results than the 16-hour one, we need to establish what working actually means in cognitive terms, because the cultural confusion between being present at a desk and being genuinely productive is the specific misunderstanding from which the 16-hour myth derives most of its apparent plausibility. When a knowledge worker, a creative professional, or a strategic decision maker is doing their most important work, the work that produces genuine value, the work that advances the definite chief aim, the work that creates rather than merely manages, they are engaging the prefrontal cortex in its most demanding function. They are directing focused, sustained, cognitively intensive attention at a specific complex problem or task. They are holding multiple considerations in working memory, evaluating them against each other, generating novel connections between them, and making the specific kinds of non-routine decisions that produce the outputs that matter. This process is metabolically expensive. The prefrontal cortex, as we have established in earlier episodes through Roy Baumeister's research, is a glucose-intensive structure that depletes its operational resources with use. The specific quality of attention required for genuine creative, strategic, or analytical work, the full, undivided, deeply engaged attention that produces the outputs worth producing, is available for a finite period before cognitive fatigue begins to degrade its quality. Anders Ericsson at Florida State University, whose deliberate practice research we have discussed in the context of the Work Hard episode, documented this ceiling with extraordinary precision across the most comprehensive study of elite performance ever conducted. The finding that the popular account of Ericsson's research consistently omits the finding that neither Malcolm Gladwell's popularization of the 10,000 hours principle nor the hustle culture's appropriation of it has ever adequately communicated is this: the best performers in every domain he studied rarely exceeded 4 hours of deliberate practice per day, not because they lacked the dedication to do more, not because they were soft or undisciplined or insufficiently committed to their craft, because the specific quality of focused, cognitively intensive, feedback-rich engagement that constitutes deliberate practice, the quality that produces genuine skill development rather than the mere repetition of existing capability, cannot be sustained beyond approximately 4 hours. Without the quality degrading to the point where the practice produces diminishing and eventually negative returns. The concert violinists who reached the highest levels of performance were not the ones who practiced the most total hours. They were the ones who accumulated the most hours of genuine, deliberate practice and who then protected their cognitive resources through adequate sleep, regular rest, and the specific kind of unfocused leisure that allows the neural resources required for deliberate practice to recover for the next session. The violinists at the top of the performance distribution slept more than their less accomplished peers. They rested more. Their total hours of practice were not the highest in the study. Their hours of deliberate, high-quality, genuine output practice were. And they had learned, through the experiential feedback of years of observing their own performance, that exceeding the 4-hour ceiling produced not more progress, but the appearance of progress, the mechanical repetition of already established patterns that had no developmental effect and that cost the resources required for genuine development the next day. This is the specific finding that Rockefeller's 4-hour days, Darwin's 4.5-hour days, and Poincaré's 4-hour days were not instances of insufficient ambition, but of the specific, evidence-based, cognitively sophisticated understanding of the actual ceiling on genuine productive output. They were not working less than their capacity. They were working exactly at their capacity and protecting the conditions required to maintain that capacity across a career, rather than consuming it in a decade of heroic overproduction. Now let us add to Erickson's research the findings of Nathaniel Kleitman, the University of Chicago sleep researcher, who first described the architecture of sleep cycles and who, in a less celebrated but equally important contribution, described the ultradian rhythm that governs the cycling of cognitive performance throughout the waking day. Kleitman is best known for co-discovering REM sleep with his student Eugene Aserinsky in 1953. But his research on the waking brain's rhythmic alternation between high-performance focus states and low-performance rest-seeking states, which he called the basic rest activity cycle, or BRAC, is directly relevant to the question of why 4 hours of concentrated work is the practical ceiling and why the structure of work matters as much as its duration. The BRAC describes a roughly 90-minute oscillation in the brain's activity level that operates throughout the 24-hour day, not only during sleep, where it governs the alternation between REM and non-REM phases, but during waking, where it governs the brain's natural cycling between states of high-focused attention and states of lower, more diffuse, less directed arousal. The waking expression of the BRAC means that the brain naturally moves through approximately 90 minutes of higher quality focused attention before entering a physiological period of lower performance, a period in which the urge to pause, the difficulty sustaining concentration, the increased susceptibility to distraction, and the subtle but measurable degradation in the quality of cognitive output are not signs of weakness or insufficient discipline, but the brain's natural, rhythmically determined signal that a rest period is required before the next focus cycle can begin at full capacity. This is the biological foundation of Darwin's working schedule. 3 sessions of approximately 90 minutes each, separated by genuine breaks, walks, rest, non-cognitively demanding activity. He was not dividing his day that way from habit or preference or the intellectual fashion of Victorian naturalists. He was, whether consciously or through the experiential observation of his own cognitive performance, aligning his work schedule with the underlying biological rhythm of his brain's performance cycle. The person who works from dawn to dusk without respecting the ultradian rhythm is not working more than the person who takes the biological breaks the rhythm requires. They are working more hours at progressively degrading quality spending, the same total cognitive fuel more rapidly and at lower efficiency, producing less total output of lower average quality, and arriving at the end of the day more depleted and less able to restore the resources the next day's work will require. The person who respects the rhythm, who works in focused 90-minute blocks, rests genuinely between them and stops the focused work. When the day's BRAC cycles have been fully used, is working fewer hours at consistently higher quality, producing more total output of higher average quality, and arriving at the end of the day with enough remaining cognitive resource to engage in the specific rest and restoration practices that prepare the brain for the next day's work. Over a career, the difference in total high-quality output is not marginal. It is the difference between the compounding productivity of a brain operated within its biological parameters and the declining productivity of a brain progressively depleted by the organized refusal to respect those parameters. This is the pattern Hill observed. Not in the language of ultradian rhythms or deliberate practice ceilings, those concepts did not exist in his era, but in the specific, observable, documented reality of the men he studied, men who had learned through decades of close observation of their own cognitive performance, that the specific quantity of focused work that produced the maximum quality output was far less than the culture's narrative of heroic effort implied. Let us now go to the specific documentation of John D. Rockefeller's working habits because the specific, historical, carefully observed account of how the most successful businessman in American history actually spent his working days is the most direct refutation of the 16-hour mythology available. Rockefeller was, from his earliest years in business, a man of methodical organization rather than frenzied effort. His biographers, including Ron Chernow, whose authoritative biography, Titan, remains the most comprehensive account of his life, document a work style that would strike most contemporary productivity culture advocates as almost recklessly moderate. Rockefeller's genius was not in the volume of his personal effort. It was in the quality of his organizational intelligence, his specific, extraordinary capacity to design systems, select the right people, and establish the structures that allowed the empire he was building to function with maximum efficiency without requiring his continuous personal oversight. He delegated with a comprehensiveness that his peers found extraordinary. He trusted the people he had selected and trained with a confidence that because it was earned through the specific, accurate evaluation of their capabilities rather than through wishful hope, was almost always justified. And he directed his own focused attention to the specific, highest leverage decisions and relationships that only he could handle, the strategic decisions, the key relationships, the organizational questions whose resolution required his specific combination of knowledge and judgment. The result was a working day that, even in the most active period of Standard Oil's expansion, was organized around the protection of the cognitive quality required for those highest leverage decisions, not the multiplication of his personal involvement in every dimension of the operation, the concentration of his best hours on the specific activities that only he could do, and the rigorous elimination through delegation, through organizational design, through the specific discipline of saying no of every other demand on his attention. As the empire matured and as Rockefeller's confidence in his organization deepened, his working hours shortened progressively. By his middle years, he was working mornings and resting in the afternoons. By his later years, the rhythm was closer to what the title of this video describes, a morning of concentrated work, followed by the kind of genuine, unscheduled, cognitively undemanding rest that the science now identifies as the specific period during which the brain consolidates, processes, and prepares for the next cycle of focused engagement. He played golf, he took naps, he spent time in the garden. He engaged in the kind of unhurried, physically active, mentally undemanding activity that restored the cognitive resources his morning's focused work had used. And the Standard Oil empire, which he was not present at his desk to manage during these hours, continued to function because the organizational infrastructure he had built was specifically designed not to require his continuous presence. The empire worked so well when he was not working that his absence was itself evidence of the extraordinary quality of his morning's work. This is the specific historical documented model that this video is presenting, not the mythology of the sleepless, self-sacrificing titan who gave everything to the work. The specific, cognitively sophisticated, organizationally intelligent reality of a man who understood that his most valuable contribution was the quality of his most focused hours, and who protected that quality with the specific discipline of not exceeding it. Now let us examine what was happening in the non-working hours. Because the cultural narrative of the 16-hour day is not merely wrong about what the most extraordinary achievers actually did, it is wrong about what the non-working hours actually are and what they actually produce. The hours that Rockefeller spent playing golf, that Darwin spent walking on the thinking path, that Dickens spent walking through London, that Beethoven spent walking in the parks of Vienna, these hours were not the absence of work. They were a different form of work. The form of work that the focused, consciously directed, prefrontally managed work of the morning made possible, and that made the next morning's focused work possible in return. The neuroscience of this reciprocal relationship is found in the research on what Matthew Walker calls sleep-dependent memory consolidation, and what cognitive neuroscientists describe more broadly as the rest-dependent processing of the default mode network. The DMN, which we have discussed in detail in previous episodes, is not idle during the unfocused, undemanding activity of the recovery period. It is doing the most sophisticated integrative processing the brain performs, making the far-reaching associative connections between the morning's focused work and the accumulated store of knowledge and experience that the focused work itself was too narrowly directed to access. Darwin's afternoon walks were not interruptions of the thinking. They were the thinking, the specific, DMN-mediated, associative, creative processing of the problems the morning's focused work had staged but not resolved. The half-formed hypothesis that arrived on the sandwalk, the connection between two observations that had been separately present in the morning's notes, but whose relationship had not been visible until the afternoon's unfocused wandering, allowed the DMN to make it. This is the specific mechanism by which the 4-hour worker produces more original, more generative, more genuinely valuable output than the 16-hour worker, not despite the shorter hours of focused work, but because of what the longer hours of genuine, unstructured, DMN active recovery produce in the periods between them. The 16-hour worker does not have these periods. The 16-hour worker's recovery hours are, in practice, the low-quality, partially focused, distraction-managed hours at the end of the day when the prefrontal cortex is depleted enough that the focused work is no longer genuinely focused, but the sense of obligation to the desk prevents the genuine release into the conversant, unstructured rest that the DMN requires to do its work. The 16-hour worker's brain never fully makes the transition from the depleted but effortful focused state to the genuinely resting DMN state. The specific incremental degradation of the work quality, the ideas that get less original as the day extends, the decisions that get less precise as the afternoon becomes evening, is not the price paid for the additional output. It is the evidence that the additional output is not being produced. That what is being produced in those extended hours is the appearance of work, the presence at the desk, the movement of tasks from one column to another, rather than the genuine high-quality, value-producing output that the best hours of the morning contain. Rockefeller understood this. Carnegie understood this. Darwin demonstrated it in the most thoroughly documented daily schedule of any scientist in history. Poincaré articulated it with the precision of a man who had watched his own mathematical thinking degrade in real time as the day extended past the cognitive boundary of the afternoon. The morning hours were the work. The afternoon was the incubation. The evening was the rest that made the next morning possible. And the organization of the day around this specific biologically determined, cognitively validated rhythm was not a compromise with the demands of extraordinary ambition. It was the specific, practical, evidence-based understanding of how extraordinary ambition is most efficiently served by the specific capabilities of the human brain. There's a specific and important question that the evidence we have presented so far implies but has not yet directly addressed. If 4 hours of focused work is genuinely more productive than 16, why does the 16-hour mythology persist? Who benefits from it? And how has it survived the specific, documented, historically visible evidence against it that the lives of the most extraordinary achievers provide? The answer involves two distinct phenomena that operate simultaneously and that together explain the extraordinary resilience of the 16-hour narrative. The first is the confusion between visibility and output, the specific cultural mechanism by which effort is measured in visible hours rather than in actual productive output, and by which the person working 16 visible hours is rewarded with social recognition regardless of what those 16 hours actually contain. The sociologist Max Weber described, in his account of the Protestant work ethic, the specific cultural mechanism by which industriousness, the visible, demonstrable application of effort acquired moral significance, independent of the outcomes it produced. The person who worked hard was virtuous. The person who rested was morally suspect. And the specific observable proxy for hard work, the number of hours spent at the desk, the visible evidence of effortful presence became the primary social measure of the virtue that actual productive output should have measured. This cultural inheritance is still operating in organizational contexts. The person working 16 hours signals commitment, dedication, and the specific form of loyalty that organizations reward with promotion and security, regardless of whether those 16 hours produce more genuine output than 6 hours of high quality, properly rested, focused work. In social contexts, the person who exhausts themselves in service of their ambition signals the seriousness that earns the respect of people who equate suffering with worthiness. The 16-hour day has become the primary performance of ambition, the specific, visible, socially legible demonstration that one is genuinely serious about the goal. And the performance, because it is performed in public and because it generates the social reward of recognition, is maintained even at the specific cost of the cognitive quality that genuine achievement requires. This is the first phenomenon, the social performance of effort substituting for the genuine production of it. The second phenomenon is more specifically economic, and it is the one that Hill's 20 years of studying the relationship between the most ordinary workers and the most extraordinary achievers makes most visible. The 16-hour worker is the most exploitable worker, not in a crude or necessarily malicious sense, in the specific structural sense that the person who confuses the quantity of their effort with the quality of their contribution is the person who consistently produces more value than they are compensated for, because the measure of their compensation is the hours they work, while the measure of the value they produce is the quality of those hours. And the relationship between the two is not proportional. The person who works 16 hours but produces 8 hours of genuine high-quality output is, in economic terms, donating 8 hours of effort to the organization that employs them. The person who works 6 hours of genuine high-quality output and then stops is producing approximately the same value and is protecting, through the specific discipline of stopping, the cognitive resources required to produce the same value tomorrow and the day after and the year after that. The organizational systems and the cultural narratives that benefit from the donation of the additional 8 hours have a structural interest in maintaining the belief that 16 hours of presence is the appropriate measure of genuine effort. And those systems and narratives are sufficiently pervasive, sufficiently continuously reinforced, and sufficiently culturally embedded that the specific, documented, historically visible evidence against them. The 4-hour days of the most extraordinary achievers in history has been effectively invisible to the people who most need to see it. Hill saw it. He was not a sociologist or an organizational economist, but he was a rigorous, direct, honest observer of the specific relationship between the way the most extraordinary people he studied invested their cognitive resources and the outcomes those investments produced. And the relationship he documented consistently across 500 lives in every domain of extraordinary achievement was not the relationship between heroic effort and extraordinary outcome. It was the relationship between specifically directed, carefully bounded, quality over quantity, concentrated effort, and the specific compounding extraordinary outcomes that this quality of effort maintained over a career, reliably produced. Let us now examine the specific work habits of some of Hill's most directly studied subjects, because the historical documentation of how Carnegie, Ford, and Edison actually spent their days is available and is, in the context of what this video is presenting, extraordinarily revealing. Andrew Carnegie, whose specific documented relationship with Napoleon Hill produced the philosophy this channel is dedicated to presenting, was not a man of 16-hour days. He was a man of extraordinary organizational leverage, which is the specific quality that made his hours, however many or few, produce the returns they did. Carnegie's genius was delegation and organization, the specific strategic quality of judgment work that required his focused attention for a bounded, manageable period of hours, and that, once he had applied it, produced organizational results that operated without his continuous oversight. He built an inner circle, the mastermind alliance, precisely to extend the quality of his thinking beyond the limits of his own focused hours. And he invested heavily in the specific high-leverage strategic decisions that only he could make while systematically eliminating or delegating everything else. The result was a working day organized around the quality of the few hours that genuinely required his highest capacity, not the maximum number of hours the body could sustain at some level of presence. And the empire that these few hours of quality produced, compounded through the organizational infrastructure he had built, was not proportional to the hours invested in the conventional quantity of effort sense. It was the specific, disproportionate, leveraged return on hours invested at the maximum quality level that the focused, well-rested, cognitively fresh prefrontal cortex can produce. Thomas Edison is perhaps the most frequently cited figure in the mythology of the tireless inventor. The image of a man who worked continuously, who slept only in brief naps, who gave everything to the work with a totality of dedication that made ordinary human need for rest seem like an indulgence. This image is, in important respects, accurate. Edison did work long hours in the most intense periods of invention. He did nap at his desk, on his laboratory table, wherever sleep found him. The dedication was genuine, and the hours were real. But the specific quality of Edison's work schedule reveals something that the mythology obscures. The long hours were not a continuous stream of focused, high-quality, genuinely productive cognitive engagement. They were interspersed with the specific, deliberate, strategic napping that we discussed in the 4 a.m. episode, the steel balls, the hypnagogic boundary, the specific, regular, structured access to the transitional state between focused work and deep rest that Edison had identified as the most reliably productive state available to him. Edison's long hours were not 16 hours of deliberate practice in Erickson's sense. They were a specific alternation between focused work, strategic napping, and the kind of informal, collaborative, socially engaged laboratory culture that provided the equivalent of the DMN's associative processing in a social rather than a solitary form. The total time at the laboratory was long. The total time in the specific, focused, cognitively demanding, high-quality output state was not. And Henry Ford, whose productivity cult the automobile industry has spent a century celebrating, was, by the accounts of the people who worked closest to him, a man who spent large portions of his working day wandering through the factory, observing, thinking, engaging in the kind of unhurried, unscheduled, physically active, mentally undemanding activity that the DMN research identifies as the specific recovery and processing state that makes the next focus session possible. Ford's great contribution to manufacturing was not the relentless 16-hour application of his personal cognitive resources. It was the organizational genius of the assembly line, a system that, once built, operated continuously regardless of whether Ford was present, working, or napping. The most productive thing Ford ever did was to build an organizational system so good that his personal presence became irrelevant to its operation, which is, in the most direct sense possible, the opposite of the workaholic myth. Now let us build a scientific case with the precision that the evidence supports. Because the claim this video is making that 4 hours of high-quality, focused work is not merely as good as 16, but genuinely, measurably, compoundingly better requires more than the pattern of historical observation and the ceiling research of Erickson and Kleitman. It requires the specific mechanistic account of why quality-bounded work produces better outcomes than quantity-focused work over time. The mechanistic account has three components. The first is the cognitive fatigue curve. Research by Sean Carroll and colleagues documenting the specific degradation of prefrontal function with extended use provides the quantitative foundation. The prefrontal cortex's performance does not decline linearly. With use, it declines according to a specific accelerating curve, in which the first period of use produces relatively little degradation, the middle period produces moderate degradation, and the extended period produces rapid and severe degradation that continues until genuine rest reverses it. The practical implication: the first 90 minutes of focused work produces high-quality output at the cost of moderate cognitive resource expenditure. The second 90-minute session, taken after a genuine break, produces similarly high-quality output at a similar cost. The third session, taken with another break, begins to show quality degradation. And the fourth, fifth, and sixth sessions, the sessions that constitute the difference between the 4-hour and the 16-hour day, are increasingly expensive in cognitive resource terms and increasingly poor in output quality terms. The 16-hour worker is not producing 4 times the output of the 4-hour worker. They are producing approximately the same high-quality output, the 4 hours of genuine focused productivity that the cognitive fatigue curve allows, plus 12 additional hours of degraded quality output that feels like work but produces, in terms of the value that matters, a fraction of what the genuine hours produced. The second component is the restoration curve. The research on sleep-dependent memory consolidation, DMN processing, and the specific recovery timeline of depleted cognitive resources establishes that genuine cognitive restoration requires genuine rest, not the low-quality, screen-mediated, partially active rest of the extended working day's evenings, but the specific neurological events of deep sleep, DMN active recovery, and the hypnagogic processing that we have discussed in detail in previous episodes. The person who works 16 hours and sleeps 6 has less total recovery time than the person who works 4 hours of focused work and sleeps 8. And the recovery time they do have is arriving at a more depleted starting point and is therefore producing less total restoration. Over time, over a career, over the specific compounding trajectory of cognitive performance that the most extraordinary achievers in history maintained, the 4-hour worker whose recovery is consistently adequate arrives at each new working day with a consistently restored, consistently high-quality cognitive system. The 16-hour worker whose recovery is chronically insufficient arrives at each new working day with a progressively more depleted, one whose peak performance diminishes, whose creative range narrows, whose best work becomes gradually less distinguishable from their ordinary work. The third component is the incubation dividend, the specific, measurable, research-confirmed value of the DMN processing that occurs during the non-working hours of the quality-bounded working day. Research by A.P. Dijkster-Huys at the University of Amsterdam on what he calls the unconscious thought theory documents that certain categories of complex, multivariable decision, the kind of strategic, creative, integrative thinking that constitutes the most important work of the most extraordinary achievers, are better served by periods of conscious disengagement followed by the return of focused attention than by continuous conscious effort. The specific mechanism, focused conscious attention, is excellent at processing specific, well-defined problems along known analytical pathways, but complex, integrative, creative problems, the problems that require the synthesis of many variables across many domains in ways that no single analytical framework can contain, are processed more comprehensively by the unconscious systems during periods of apparent rest, because the unconscious processing is not constrained by the sequential, framework-dependent, analytically bounded character of focused conscious attention. This is a specific scientific account of what Darwin's sandwalk was doing, what Beethoven's afternoon walks were doing, what Rockefeller's golf was doing, not nothing. not rest in the passive sense. The specific, active, DMN-mediated, unconscious thought-enabled processing of the morning's most complex problems, arriving at the connections, the syntheses, the reframings that the morning's focused work had staged but not completed. The incubation dividend is the return on the non-working hours. And the person whose non-working hours are genuinely non-working, genuinely unstructured, genuinely physically active, genuinely free from the cognitive demand of further work-related processing, receives this dividend consistently and applies it to the next morning's focused work. The person who fills the non-working hours with additional work-adjacent activity, more emails, more planning, more strategizing, more consumption of work-related content, does not receive the dividend. The brain, never fully released from the work-related cognitive mode, cannot make the transition to the DMN's unstructured associative processing that the dividend requires. Let us now build the practical framework, the specific, operationally complete account of how to restructure a working life around 4 hours of genuine, high-quality, focused work in a way that produces not just equal but superior long-term results to the quantity-focused approach. The first element is the identification and protection of the peak performance window. The brain's peak cognitive performance does not occur uniformly throughout the waking day. Research by Carolyn Anderson and colleagues on the diurnal variation in cognitive performance documents that most people have a specific, consistent, biologically determined peak performance window, the period of the day during which the specific combination of alertness, working memory capacity, and prefrontal executive function is at its highest. For the majority of people, this window falls in the late morning, approximately 2 to 4 hours after waking, following the initial cortisol spike of waking, but before the post-lunch dip in alertness and the progressive cognitive fatigue of the afternoon. For a minority of people with strongly evening-oriented chronotypes, the window may fall later in the day. The specific identification of your personal peak performance window through the honest observation of your own cognitive quality at different times of day is the prerequisite for the quality over quantity work structure. Because the 4 hours of focused work that produces maximum output must be the 4 hours during which the brain is at its biological peak, not simply the first 4 hours after arrival at the desk. Rockefeller's morning work sessions were not arbitrary. They aligned with a specific biologically determined period during which his prefrontal cortex was operating at its highest daily capacity. Darwin's 3 90-minute sessions, distributed across the morning hours, made the same alignment. The decision to stop the focused work before that window had been exhausted was not a concession to preference. It was the specific protection of the most valuable cognitive resource, the peak window hours of the next day, from the depletion that extending the current day's session would produce. The second element is the design of the focused session. Each focused session, 90 minutes in length, aligned with the ultradian rhythm, contained within the peak performance window, must have the specific design features that Erickson identified as distinguishing genuine, deliberate practice from the mere performance of effort. A specific, clearly defined task that is at the edge of current capability, challenging enough to require full cognitive engagement, not so challenging that the prefrontal executive function cannot manage it. A clear success criterion that allows the assessment of whether the session produced genuine output, the complete elimination of external interruptions during the session's duration, the phone, the email, the notification, the social demand that does not respect the 90-minute window, and a genuine transition out of the session, not the gradual blurring fade from focused work into distracted semi-work that most desk workers experience, but a clean, deliberate, conscious stopping at the session's end. The third element is the genuine inter-session recovery. Between focused sessions, and particularly after the day's focused work is complete, the recovery must be genuine in the neurological sense that Kleitman's ultradian rhythm research requires. not the passive recovery of continued screen time in a less demanding mode, not the semi-active recovery of podcasts and content consumption that maintains a level of cognitive engagement just below the threshold of focused work. The genuine recovery that restores the prefrontal resources and activates the DMN's incubation dividend is physical movement, the walking, the exercise, the non-cognitively demanding physical activity that Darwin and Beethoven and Dickens maintained with the consistency of people who had learned from direct observation that the quality of the next focused session depended directly on the quality of the preceding recovery. Social engagement in contexts unrelated to the work. The specifically unstructured, agenda-free time that allows the mind to wander without direction and to make the associations that directed thinking cannot produce. The fourth element is the discipline of stopping. This is the element that the quality-bounded work structure demands that is most directly contrary to the quantity-focused cultural narrative. The discipline of stopping, of ending the focused work when the peak window has been used and the day's focus sessions have been completed, regardless of the ambient social pressure to continue, regardless of the work that remains undone, regardless of the specific guilt and anxiety of the achievement-oriented person who equates stopping with laziness, is the specific, non-negotiable feature of the 4-hour structure that makes everything else possible. Stopping at noon or at 2 or at whatever point the focus sessions of the peak window have been completed is not a limitation imposed on the ambition. It is the specific, disciplined investment in the quality of the next morning's work that makes the compound trajectory of the quality-bounded worker's output superior to the quantity-focused worker's over time. Rockefeller's discipline was not in the length of his working hours. It was in the specific boundary-maintaining stop-at-noon structure that protected the quality of the hours he did work from the progressive degradation that extending them would have produced. There is a specific economic argument against what this video is describing that deserves to be addressed directly because it is the argument most commonly offered by the people most invested in the 16-hour mythology. The argument is, results matter, and the person who works 16 hours is producing more results than the person who works 4, regardless of the quality differential, because more work time equals more work done. This argument contains a genuine truth and a specific consequential error. The genuine truth is that output is what matters. The compounding trajectory of a definite chief aim is built from the specific, measurable, real-world outputs of directed effort, and more total hours of effort produces more total output than fewer total hours, all else equal. The consequential error is in the all else equal, because all else is not equal. The quality of the output differs between the focused hours and the depleted hours. The innovation capacity differs. The strategic vision differs. The creative synthesis differs. And in the specific domains that produce the most extraordinary results, the domains of organizational strategy, creative production, strategic decision-making, and the specific kind of original thinking that creates new categories of value rather than executing within existing ones, the quality differential between peak performance focused work and depleted extended hours work is not a marginal variation. It is the difference between the kind of thinking that produces the assembly line and the kind of thinking that manages its output. Ford did not design the assembly line in his 16th hour of a working day. The specific organizational insight that transformed manufacturing was produced in exactly the kind of focused, cognitively fresh, peak performance mental state that the structure of deliberate, quality-bounded work is designed to produce and protect. The thousands of additional hours Ford spent in and around the factory before and after that specific insight were useful in many ways. They provided the contextual knowledge, the observational foundation, the specific problem awareness that the insight required. But the insight itself was not produced by the maximum accumulation of presence hours. It was produced by the specific quality of cognitive engagement that peak performance hours provide. This is the specific economic truth that the quantity-focused argument misses. The most valuable outputs, the ones that produce the extraordinary, compounding, leverage-creating results that Hill documented in the 500 most extraordinary lives, are not produced in proportion to hours invested. They are produced in the specific cognitive state that quality-bounded, properly rested, peak performance-focused work makes available. And that state is not available in the extended hours of the depleted day. The assembly line, in the context of the 4-hour versus 16-hour argument, is a metaphor as much as a historical fact. The person who works 4 hours of genuine, deliberate, quality-bounded, focused work and then rests is not merely producing the same output as the 16-hour worker. They are producing a different kind of output, one that, through the specific leverage of organizational intelligence, creative synthesis, and strategic vision that the peak performance cognitive state enables, can produce returns on the invested hours that the quantity-focused approach, regardless of its total hour investment, cannot match. Hill knew this. He did not have the research. He had the observation, and his observation, expressed in the language of organized effort and the distinction between organized and disorganized labor, the principle of concentration, and the specific description of the definite chief aim's capacity to direct effort toward maximum leverage, was the specific practical account of what the science now explains in mechanistic detail. The organized effort in service of the definite chief aim is not 16 hours of unfocused presence multiplied by ambition. It is the specific, quality-bounded, peak performance-focused application of the highest available cognitive resources to the highest leverage activities that the definite chief aim requires, followed by the genuine rest and incubation that makes the next application possible at the same quality level. This is the structure of the extraordinary working lives Hill observed, not the mythology, the reality. And the reality is available to anyone willing to accept its most challenging implication, that the discipline required for extraordinary achievement is not the discipline of working longer. It is the discipline of working better, and the specific, socially uncomfortable, culturally countercultural discipline of stopping when better is no longer possible. Rockefeller quit at noon, not because he was finished with ambition, because he understood better than almost anyone else of his era that the morning's focused hours were where his contribution happened, and that protecting the next morning's focused hours required the specific disciplined gift of rest that the afternoon and evening provided. This is the structure. This is the model. And this is the specific, historically documented, scientifically validated, practically available alternative to the 16-hour mythology that has been keeping ambitious, capable, genuinely motivated people exhausted and underproductive for decades. The practical implication of everything in this video is not the permission to do less. It is the instruction to do differently, to stop measuring your commitment by the number of hours at the desk and start measuring it by the specific observable quality of what those hours produce in the direction of the definite chief aim. This week, before the end of the week, conduct the specific, honest audit that the evidence demands. How many of your working hours in the last 7 days were genuinely in the peak performance, focused, cognitively fresh, full capacity state that the Erickson and Kleitman research identifies as the specific quality of work that produces the results that matter? Not the hours you were present, not the hours you were trying, the hours in which the thinking was genuinely at its best, the hours in which the work produced the kind of output that the extended, depleted hours would not have produced regardless of how much more of them there were. Write that number. Be honest. For most people, the number is smaller than the total working hours by a factor of 3 or 4. Then write the specific structural change to your working week that would increase the quality of those peak hours while protecting the recovery that makes their quality sustainable. The specific time at which you will begin the first focused session, the specific time at which you will stop it, the specific genuine recovery activity that will follow it, the specific elimination of one category of extended hours presence that the evidence says is costing cognitive resources without producing proportional results. This is the beginning of the 4-hour structure, not the complete implementation that takes time and iteration and the specific observational attunement to your own cognitive performance that the structure requires, but the beginning. Write the change in the comments, not the aspiration, the specific structural this week commitment, because the community that gathers in these comments is the specific kind of mastermind that Hill said was available to anyone willing to build it. And the social accountability of a publicly stated structural commitment is one of the most reliable behavioral predictors available. If this video changed something in how you understand the relationship between the hours you work and the results they produce, if it gave you the specific historical scientific permission to stop apologizing for the quality-bounded working structure that the best of you already knows is the right one, share it with the person in your life who is working 16 hours a day and wondering why the extraordinary results the hours should be producing are not arriving. Subscribe if you want to stay close to the rigorous, honest, depth-first tradition of this channel. And then quit at noon, not as a concession, as a discipline.